Hey everybody, welcome to Sticky Notes here for solid waste, sediment, and thermal pollution. This is topic 8.6. We're starting out on page 397 here. So the first thing we have to talk about here is solid waste. Solid waste is an APES term that you should use in place of trash, litter, or garbage. Basically, it's any physical non-organic waste that enters waterways, and we could consider things such as plastic cups, old tires, food wrappers, paper, even if it's a newspaper or something that doesn't easily break down, getting into waterways. It's important to also distinguish what is not solid waste. So we don't consider feces, actual human waste, as solid waste. We consider that sewage. So it's a little bit different because it breaks down pretty quickly in the water. And we have fertilizers, those are not solid wastes, food scraps, and then things like battery acids or radioactive waste, like toxic wastes, are not technically considered solid waste. Although we'll talk about at the bottom, toxic materials can be released from some solid waste sources. But it's important to differentiate there. Solid waste can enter bodies of water by being directly and purposefully dumped into water, which is common in the ocean, especially by companies or individuals in countries where there are really relaxed or not strict environmental laws and regulations. So you can see a picture of this here, really prevalent issue, again, in places where environmental protections are not as robust or as strict as they are in the United States. Now, it can be harmful to aquatic life because it can entangle them or it can asphyxiate them. So think about things like the plastic rings that come around like soda cans. Those can get stuck around organisms' throats and they may suffocate. Or they can be ingested or eaten. So we've all seen this picture of a sea turtle, or the video of the sea turtle with the straw coming out of its nose. Now luckily that sea turtle was saved, but if the plastic or other material gets into the organism's stomach or its digestive tract, that can cause them to starve to death if they're unable to get food into their digestive tract. Can also be harmful to humans, and a prime example of this would be medical waste that's disposed of improperly. Could contain antibiotics or things that pose a threat as an endocrine disruptor, or it could be just things like needles, which can transmit diseases if they were used by someone who has that disease. And then the last example here is coal ash or coal slag, which can be left over from coal burning power plants, and it's particularly harmful solid waste, and it's really harmful because it's often disposed of in landfills, ponds, or abandoned mines, so it easily leaches into groundwater or runs off from land into nearby water, surface waters, and this can contaminate them with mercury, arsenic, and lead. Next we have sediment pollution. Sediment pollution is the addition of suspended particles of sand, silt, and clay to a body of water. And the main problem is it increases turbidity or cloudiness. So if we pan up here, you can see a prime example of that here. So that's going to reduce the amount of light infiltrating that body of water, which in turn decreases photosynthesis. So this is a problem because plants or producers rely on photosynthesis. So as turbidity increases or sediment pollution happens, they get less light to do less photosynthesis. And since they're the base of the food web, now the primary consumers have less of their food source. That affects secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and we get what's called a trophic cascade, where all levels of the trophic pyramid are impacted by a decrease in the producers at the bottom. This can also be detrimental to visual predators who rely on chasing down their food, and the sediment can settle on the bottom of rivers and streams, which disrupts the naturally rocky bottom of those ponds and streams, and that's a habitat that small fish species or macroinvertebrates actually depend on in order to hide from predators or search for food. So when that gets covered up by sand, silt, and clay, that takes away the habitat they need, and that can decrease the biodiversity substantially. Sediment can also clog the gills of fish, making it harder for them to breathe, and if it settles on the bottom, it can also clog the gills of oysters and clams. So there's some important economic impacts of sediment pollution. It can even contain nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. So I didn't have room for this on the sticky, but it's important to remember that sediments often contain nutrients, and so that can lead to eutrophication, dead zones, Refer back to video 8.5 for any of the effects that eutrophication can also be caused by sediment pollution. Sources of sediment pollution are human activities that include things like construction, which loosens topsoil, makes it more susceptible to erosion, plowing or tilling of agricultural fields, which does the same thing, monocropping, which leaves large areas of exposed soil with no roots or windbreaks to stabilize it, that increases erosion. And if we want to solve this issue, one easy thing to do is replant native species near bodies of water. This is something called the riparian zone of a body of water. It's the area right around its banks, and that really helps stabilize it and absorb some of the excess sediments that might be coming in runoffs. And restoration of wetlands is another really key way that we can reduce sediment pollution by restoring native wetlands nearby bodies of water. Remember, they act as huge sponges, absorbing excess runoff, filtering out contaminants, and they can allow sediment to settle to the bottom of their ecosystems, which is really how they're constructed, and so that doesn't harm them the same way it does rivers and streams. Last topic here is thermal pollution, and it may not seem like a big deal, but when heat is released into a body of water, it increases the temperature, and that can be shifted outside of the range of tolerance of many of the organisms that live in that body of water. And because warm water holds less dissolved oxygen than cold water, because oxygen as a gas is less soluble in a hotter liquid, that thermal pollution lowers the dissolved oxygen level in the water sources, and it can lead to something called thermal shock. Thermal shock is when organisms actually die due to a sudden and rapid change in temperature, and it occurs because their respiration or their breathing rate speeds up, but there's less oxygen available in the water, and so they quickly use up that oxygen and they suffocate. So it can be really, really harmful to many aquatic organisms, especially large fish. The number one source of thermal pollution is nuclear power plants, and this is because the fission reaction is so, it releases so much heat in order to turn that water into steam, to turn the turbine, that the plants have to discharge this hot water at the end of the process, and so it's often discharged into local streams, and that quickly causes thermal pollution. Now, a solution is something called a cooling tower. These are big towers that you see often outside of nuclear power plants, and they are allowing that super warmed water from the nuclear power plant to be cooled by the atmosphere. So there's some evaporation of that water, which does release water vapor into the atmosphere. Now, water vapor is a greenhouse gas. It does warm the planet, but because it's a natural greenhouse gas, it cycles very quickly through the atmosphere, so it will quickly be precipitated back down to Earth, taken out of the atmosphere, and so it's not nearly as concerning as the combustion of fossil fuels. So this cooling tower also allows for cooled water to be recycled, so it can be reused again, which decreases the amount of water that nuclear power plants have to take out of local bodies of water or ground sources. And then one last very quick thing here, we can also get hot water running off of pavement, so urban runoff can cause this, and then other electricity generation and steel production